Hey everyone, Alexandra here, back for another night of 30 Days of Symphony. Well, I hope you were good enough to indulge me in that little detour we took yesterday in getting to the summit, the mountain peaks of the four Brahms symphonies. We celebrated one of his kind of dry runs for a symphony, the first of his two orchestral serenades that he composes as a young man in the late 1850s when he's having this kind of like a dream job of a first job by being the kind of city director of music for the princely court of Detmold in northern Germany, which gave him all this time to think and compose. The two serenades leading up to the four symphonies of Brahms are like if you visit a museum, as you might visit the Art Institute of Chicago, and looking in one of their great galleries, you to this day will see, usually it's a younger man or woman who is an art student who is there on a little portable stool and standing there with a pad of paper, sketch pad, and they're copying one of the great paintings of the old masters, may it be from, the Italian Renaissance or the French Impressionists or the great moderns. You still see this go on. And that's what Brahms did in his D major serenade that we shared yesterday. It's like he's copying in the most faithful, non-derivative way from the great symphonies and serenades of, again, his musical ancestors, Haydn, Mozart, Schubert, and Beethoven, with a dash of Robert Schumann, his conflicted mentor, Schumann being the ultimate tortured artist of 19th century music, thrown in for good measure. Well, again, that was the late 1850s. And then by the 1860s, Brahms's friends and admirers, and by this time there were quite a few of them. They included some of the greatest musicians in Germany then, like Robert's widow, the great pianist Clara Schumann, with whom he had this very complicated lifelong friendship. The great violinist Joseph Joachim, who would eventually give the premiere of his violin concerto. Everyone is urging him to write a symphony. And I was reading recently a recent kind of a current music critic historian who, in this trendy fashion these days, accused Brahms of deliberately waiting for a good 20 years. As I was saying yesterday, the premiere of Brahms's first symphony took place when he was 43, no spring chicken in 1876. That Brahms did this deliberately, that he was this very trendy anthropological phrase. He was devising his own creation myth, putting himself forward as the great savior of German music. Late in time, behold him come, here now at long last, the successor to Beethoven. This is ridiculous. Brahms, like Beethoven, at the end of the day was just a person like you or me. And he was very gifted, very talented, very diligent, had a great work ethic, and he just bided his time because Brahms was a very modest man. He came from a very modest background. By his later years, he was, along with, I guess, Verdi, in Italy, the great Italian opera composer. He was easily like the wealthiest composer in Europe. And he always, when he would get onto a train, back then they didn't fly, of course, it was all about trains. He would always get into it. He would always buy a ticket for a third class carriage, for steerage. Because he was just a simple, modest guy who came from a working class background, who didn't put on airs. He just happened to be one of the greatest composers who ever lived. And in his own modest way, Brahms was biding his time and making sketches and thinking about writing a symphony that, when he wrote it, it would be, and it was, a worthy successor to the symphonies of Ludwig van Beethoven. Again, we have this middle generation, the generation of his direct musical forebears, Schumann and Mendelssohn, whose symphonies we'll get to later in our journey. A vital kind of middle stage in the development. Their symphonies, as great and beautiful as they are, could never be the titanic masterpieces that Beethoven gave us. Brahms, he waits for his moment and then he seizes it. And he writes in his four symphonies that are worthy to be considered in the same breath as those of Beethoven. Brahms's four symphonies are each perfect four-movement classical symphonies brought into the language of late Romanticism. The great German conductor, the late German conductor, Kurt Masur, once made the very astute remark that his four symphonies are so perfect in every way that each of them is kind of like a giant movement and kind of like a mega Brahms symphony. And if the first symphony is about the torrents of youth, the raging passions of young adulthood, the second symphony, the kind of pastoral symphony, if you will, of Beethoven, written after a long summer idyll in the countryside, is this work of the kind of the relaxed inner security that comes with someone's journey into early middle age. The complicated, elusive, ruminative third symphony is all about the augurs of later middle age. And then the fourth symphony, his last symphony, is truly a symphonic portrait of the lion in winter. The great Brahms is the old man shaking his fist at the oncoming train of fate. But today, of course, we concentrate on Symphony No. 1, his symphonic calling card to the world. As I said, Brahms bided his time to write this symphony, and after over a decade of sketches for it, the work was finally premiered in the year 1876, when Brahms was a ripe old man of 43. Well, the wait was worth it for the musical world, because from the very beginning, Brahms, as the great modern composer Arnold Schoenberg would remark, Brahms was the great progressive conservative. He was an utterly progressive and original force as an artist, but he always did so within the realm of this great Central European tradition. You sense this from the very beginning of the symphony. The symphony, my friends, again, key signatures are so vital. They are part of the language that we speak as classical musicians. His first symphony is in the key of C minor. Remember what that is? C minor. That's the key of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. So from the very beginning, he's signaling to his audience, because there are all these subconscious signals in Brahms. There's the conscious Brahms, the subconscious Brahms, and then there's the Brahms that's like so subconscious, that's like part of his emotional life that he would never share openly. Again, this man who was single his entire life. But subconsciously, he's again, to his audience, he's already setting the bar high. Okay, the key of Beethoven's Fifth, for goodness sake. There is this overwhelmingly forceful, this tsunami of a slow introduction. Again, the slow introduction before the main first movement sonata allegro is by this point de rigueur in a classical symphony. But what an introduction. You get, the thing to listen for most of all is the pounding timpani strokes, where you may not notice it at first hand, but what he's quoting here is the opening of Johann Sebastian Bach's St. Matthew Passion, the absolute foundation, the taproot, may we say, of classical, of German art music. By this point, Brahms is, again, father figure along with Schumann. Felix Mendelssohn had revived the Bach St. Matthew Passion out of obscurity. And by the mid-19th century, every serious composer, every serious musician knows their Bach, especially the Matthew Passion. Immediately, he's going to, again, setting up comparisons. He's recalling the glories of the ancient past, as it were. but in a contemporary context. What you don't realize if you're hearing this piece for the first time is he is already developing the thematic material that you're going to hear in the main body of the sonata allegro form, the main body of the first movement. You just don't know it yet. And then this is another basic thing about the genius of Brahms. Again, to quote Arnold Schoenberg, that early modern Viennese composer of what we call the Second Viennese School. Again, Brahms is the progressive conservative in this, again, to use Schoenberg's phrase, Brahms's way of using this, developing this technique that he kind of gets from Beethoven, but masters it on his own. This technique called developing variation, where a little tiny melodic cell, very often not more than 2 or 3 notes, is constantly developed, constantly regenerated, that goes beyond the very straight-laced classical sonata allegro traditions of exposition, development, and recapitulation. Brahms, building on the genius of composers like Beethoven and Schubert and Robert Schumann, it should also be said, has this language of developing variation. People ask me, what makes classical music so great? I say, listen, listen, and listen, and listen, and experience how one idea is constantly developed, constantly developed. And that's why loving classical music really is the journey of a lifetime, because you always, always learn something new. We get to the sonata allegro form, we get one of these surging, hurtling ideas in 6/8 time, like at a fast 2, da-dee-da-da-da-da-ba, which is actually by this point an idea, the kind of idea that Brahms's followers had already heard many times in his chamber music. That's a quintessentially Brahmsian idea. Not Bach, not Beethoven, Brahms. The second theme, of course, is more serene, but he's already recalling music that you heard in the slow introduction. It all wraps up to this, again, tidal wave of a symphonic climax that finally subsides, and once again, you hear those pounding timpani strokes recalled way back over the centuries from the world of J.S. Bach. The slow movement is not a slow movement like Beethoven, not at all, and it's consciously so. Here the model is the slow movements of the symphonies, the chamber music of his mentor, that his tortured, conflicted mentor of Robert Schumann. It's very much like Schumann, above all in the phrasing. Notice how the movement on one level is so long-breathed, this long, arching, songful melody, so tender, so sweet, and yet the phrases themselves, undergirding, it's like the line, the melody is the span, and the phrasing are the bridge. That's the sections of a bridge, and the melody is the road that goes across the bridge. The spans of the bridge, the phrases are very short. They're like, most melodies, if you say go to church and sing from a hymnal, most melodies in 19th century music are 4-bar phrases, 6-bar phrases, 8-bar phrases. In this slow movement, again, the melody is so long and arching, but the phrases are short. They're like 3-bar phrases, 2-bar phrases. There are even some 1-bar phrases, but they are all so sublimely spun together that you don't really notice the first time, except what you do notice is that the music has this very episodic, there's like a moodiness to it. It's a very tender theme, but it's already complicated. The other Schumann-esque touch is this radiant violin solo taken up by the concertmaster of the orchestra that concludes the slow movement. And here he's completely paying homage to Schumann once again, and that slow movement of Brahms's favorite Schumann symphony, the Symphony No. 4 in D minor, again has this radiant slow movement. So again, he's signaling, it's like the first movement with the quote from J.S. Bach, it's like the C minor key signature of Beethoven's Fifth. Once again, he's signaling to his audience that he is happily, joyously taking his place in a great symphonic tradition. The third movement is not a scherzo. By this time, by the 1870s, you expect a German Romantic era symphony to have this feisty, boisterous scherzo, because that's what Beethoven did. This is not a Beethoven scherzo in any way, shape, or form. It's this gentle, languorous kind of country dance in 2/4 time. 2/4, it's not in 1 or in 3, it's in 2/4 time. It, again, he is just gorgeously and consciously recalling the serenade tradition of his beloved Mozart. It's like a kind of music that his contemporary from Bohemia, the great Czech composer Antonin Dvorak, a colleague and also a dear friend of Brahms, we'll get to that later. Dvorak loved to do movements like this in that kind of, Bohemian outdoor music tradition. So charming. You could be in a little country inn with a glass of beer and just be right at home. The middle section of this third movement, of course, gets more Beethovenian. We get kind of a symphonic argument going, but then the gentle mood of the opening returns. It's just this, it ends in this beautiful kind of sunset of a coda. The fourth movement is where Brahms is, as we'd say in Wisconsin, he's loaded for bear. This fourth movement, the finale of the symphony, also has a lengthy, slow introduction before the main, fast, allegro, main body of the movement. This slow introduction is so long and so tortured in its development that audiences must have lost their way. They must have thought, where on earth is he going with this? Is it another slow movement that we didn't know about? Is it not a finale? He once again is immediately symphonically developing this theme that you don't know it yet will actually be the main body of the Sonata Allegro, the main body, the main theme of the main body of the movement. We then get this kind of groping, kind of pizzicato section. It again builds to a froth, and then we have this radiant chorale led by the brass and a very famous solo for the flute and for the French horn. Here, Brahms is recalling again the world of J.S. Bach with a theme that recalls like a great old Lutheran chorale, but also along the way Felix Mendelssohn, who brought Bach back out of obscurity into the mainstream of German music. We finally get to the Allegro theme, the main theme. Now here, there is again a conscious resemblance to the main theme of the finale, the Ode to Joy from Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And there's a very famous anecdote where someone said, "Oh, Herr Brahms, do you realize you quoted Beethoven here?" And he responded like, I don't want to be too profane, but he said, "Yeah, any forgive me, you can edit this out. Any dumbass can see that." Again, he knows what he's doing. He's signaling Beethoven, and he's showing to his audience in the most modest fashion possible that he can stand alongside Beethoven in this great symphonic tradition. The crowning glory of this finale is that it is, you think, a sonata allegro form of exposition, development, and recapitulation, except there's no real development section because the music, as the themes are presented, they're immediately and constantly being developed. Again, this new language, this new dialect that he establishes of developing variation, where you're constantly regenerating. This very Western idea that things of progress, that things have to constantly move forward. And Brahms does that, but he does that within the context of a tradition. At the end, after a lot of, kind of torturous argument, that radiant chorale, that Bach chorale idea is brought back then into a stirring conclusion that, again, is a conscious homage to the end of the Beethoven Fifth, the end of the Beethoven Fifth Symphony. He's doing this consciously. And do you know why he's doing it? Because he knows that he's got the talent, he's got the goods in order to get away with it. That's the sign of a true genius in the arts. Someone who dares his audience to think the worst, and they at the end are humbled by this work of genius. Well, for the Symphony of Genius to lead a performance of it, a conductor of genius, this for me is the most passionate, the most intense, the most brilliant, the most incandescent performance of the Brahms First Symphony, the Israel Philharmonic in Tel Aviv in 1973, led by one of their favorite conductors and one of the great conductors of all time, our own Leonard Bernstein.